Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to get to know your government. I'm Leora Sloibelman. I'm a junior at Gann Academy and founder and co-executive director of Save the Students. We're so excited today to be joined by a wonderful panel of government officials.
Thanks, Leora. My name is Ariella Zuckerman. I'm a sophomore at Gann Academy, and I'm the co-director of operations at State of the Students. Over the next hour, we're going to learn a little bit about what our panelists do in the government, the political process, some coronavirus-specific information, and how all of this work is meaningful in our lives. And we'll also have time at the end for some pre-submitted student questions. To start off, if all the panelists could introduce themselves and briefly describe the role that they play, we can start with Representative Nguyen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I am a state representative of the 18th Essex District, which includes Andover, Boxford, North Andover, and Tewksbury. Before I got elected, I was a legal services attorney working to help the most vulnerable clients, including people with disabilities, seniors, veterans, victims of domestic violence, and new immigrants. And I find that work to be, this new work to be a continuation of that work, really to be an advocate for those who need my help the most and to represent their voice at the State House. And especially during this pandemic, our role is to be a resource to the people in the community, to connect them to resources and services that they may need to get through this pandemic together as a community. And I'm so glad to be joined by such caring and hardworking colleagues as the folks here who are on the panel, and to really be able to connect, whether it's through different houses in the legislature, or to even connect at the federal level, as well as working with municipal leaders. But all different levels of government are all hands on deck, and I'm thrilled to be here with you and to join in this discussion.
Okay, thank you. Next, Senator Jehlen.
Hi, I'm also very pleased to be here. I love finding young people that want to get involved in government. I'm also happy to be here with my colleagues from the State House, and I want to give a special thanks to Congressman Lynch and the federal delegation for all they did in the CARES Act, and we hope we'll do in the next act, because we would not have survived in Massachusetts without the help that you've sent to us. There are 1 million people in Massachusetts now on unemployment and receiving checks, and many of them received the stimulus. Actually, more people received the stimulus checks that were sent out, and that has really kept families going and kept businesses having some customers. So we're just really grateful that that has happened, and we hope for more. So thanks for your leadership. I'm state senator for Somerville, Medford, parts of Cambridge and Winchester, and I'm chair of Elder Affairs. So I've been thinking a lot about and working a lot on issues, because older people are among the most impacted by the coronavirus. More than 60% of the deaths in Massachusetts have happened from people in nursing homes. So I've been trying to make sure that the workers in those homes had the resources they needed to care for people. And then I'm also chair of Labor and Workforce Development, which is why I'm very conscious of all the work that's gone in to implement the unemployment system, but also of the problems that have arisen there. And then thinking about how people will have to go to work, making sure that they'll be. So those are the kinds of things that I work on. And I'm eager to hear your questions and also the rest of my colleagues' work.
All very important. Thank you, Senator Jehlen. Next, if we could have Congressman Lynch explain his role.
Hello there. Good to be with you, Pat, again. Senator, thank you for your great work. Representative as well, and Senator Lovely. Good to be with you. My name's Steve Lynch. I'm a United States Congressman. I represent 19 towns and 3 cities. I represent a big part of Boston. I represent the city of Brockton and the city of Quincy, as well as 19 towns that extend from Dedham in the north to Situate in the south. So fairly large district, about 727,514 people. Before coming to Congress, I was an iron worker. And later on, I worked for 20 years as an iron worker on construction sites. And then eventually I went back to school, got my law degree, and was elected state representative. So I served with Pat Jehlen when she was a state rep, and then joined the Senate. I was only in the House for about 14 months, but I was in the Senate for almost 6 years. And then in 2001, on the day of the attacks on 9/11, I actually won the primary for the congressional seat vacated by Congressman Joan Lovely, a dear friend. Prior to coming to Congress, I also represented families in public housing. I was a labor attorney, but I also took on cases for people who had lead paint on their windows and asbestos on the pipes and things like that. So I sort of got my feel for public service in that respect, doing pro bono work as an attorney. While I don't represent Newton or Wellesley, my daughter did attend Newton school, Country Day School of the Sacred Heart, and she's now down in North Carolina. So we're having a whole college experience at my house. She came home for a spring break, and then of course they closed classes, and she's been taking exams up to last week remotely. So we're experiencing what many of you young ladies may be experiencing next year or the year thereafter. I serve on several committees. I'm the chair of the subcommittee on national security on the oversight committee in the House. I also chair the task force on fintech, financial technology. I'm also co-chair of the Families and Working Families Caucus. And I also serve on the Financial Services Committee, which covers banks, banking, but also housing and monetary policy. So those are my central obligations on committees in the House. And I will yield back.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Senator Lovely.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, or actually early evening now. It's an honor to be here today. Thank you for including me in this esteemed panel. I will tell you that I'm the senator for the 2nd Essex District, so that's Beverly, Danvers, Peabody, Salem, and Topsfield on the North Shore. In the Senate, we represent about 165,000 people, so those 5 communities make up that amount of people. I'm in my 4th term in the Senate, but before I came to the Senate, I had gotten an associate's degree right out of high school, and then got married and started a family, and always wanted to go back and finish that degree. And I did that nights and weekends from 2000 to 2006, and got that bachelor's degree in political science, and then went to law school and graduated from law school and practiced law for a little bit before I came to the Senate. But I was also involved in local government, city councilor for 15 years. And I really think that gave me the foundation to come up to the Senate and do the type of work, because I worked very closely with my community of Salem, where I live, really get to know local government and how decisions we make at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, affect us right here in our own communities. Currently, I am the chair of rules and an assistant majority leader, and the vice chair of education. So the rules committee is, in the legislature, we file about 6,000 bills every session. A lot of those are refiles. A lot of times when you file a bill the first time, it may not be ready to be passed in the first term. You work on it with advocates and with constituents, and we perfect these bills, and then we get them to the floor. But it could take several terms. So in the Rules Committee, of those 6,000 bills, about 3,000 bills can actually come through the Rules Committee, and those are policy bills. Any bill that is a money bill, that has a cost to it, goes to Ways and Means, where that's the Budget Committee. Any bills that are policy bills come through Rules. So we're pretty busy right now, trying to get a lot of these bills through the process and to the floor. And as Senator Jehlen had said, there's many bills that are important to our members, so we really work very hard to get those to the floor for consideration. I'm also vice chair, I think I said, of education. That's a first committee assignment for me, education. I've been trying to get on the education committee since I got to the State House 8 years ago. And that's a great committee, because we actually had an oversight hearing a couple of weeks ago about remote learning and what communities are more prepared to do remote learning, and which communities really need some help. Because not all communities are the same. They don't all have the same resources. But education, we want every student to have the same excellent quality education that we can provide. So a lot of times with remote learning, not every student has access to a laptop or to an iPad or a Chromebook. So to make sure that school communities are able to have these resources, they may not have internet, to make sure that everyone has access to the internet, so everyone can be learning. So we learned a lot through that oversight hearing, and what we can do, what we will be doing to make sure that all students treated equitably. This is an equitable issue. We want to make sure. So that's the work that I'm doing this session in the Senate. And again, happy to be here with you and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lovely. This is a question for all panelists. Please describe a rewarding experience that you've had while holding your current position. For example, a bill that you worked on that was meant to help a community need and the outcome of that bill. We can start off with Congressman Lynch.
Well, thank you. Actually, one of the things I'm proudest of is sort of it's not a core discipline within my legislative field, but actually in my little town, in my little neighborhood of South Boston, we had a terrible suicide cluster. We lost 16 young boys in the span of about 18 months to suicide. Some of that involved drug abuse, addiction. Much did not. And with the work of my colleagues, as I said before, I was an iron worker for about 20 years. We reached out to our friends in the building trades, the local building unions, and we built a facility, a residential facility for young men, and then one for young women who are addicted to OxyContin or to heroin. And if I were to say my proudest accomplishment, that would be it. So we have, right now we have 24 beds for boys, 20 for girls, young women. And up until that point, really in Massachusetts, we were co-locating children at adult facilities, which I think you can understand is a very precarious situation, especially for people that are recovering from substance abuse disorder. So that facility was sort of a first for us in the state. We've had wonderful success there, wonderful success stories of the people who have graduated there. Right now, we look at about 6 to 8 month residency at the Cushing House for boys and the Cushing House for girls. From there, we go to sort of a step down situation where they're living in communal housing with other young people their own age, but with supervision. Some of them need to be back in school, and we arrange that as well. And then there's independent living as well, also sober housing that we work on. So it's probably not what I expected to be doing, right? Or to have as on my resume. But I am so glad we did it. And it is, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. And I think to date, I think in terms of saving lives, I think it's probably one of the most meaningful things I've been able to accomplish in my time in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator Lovely? Oh, I'm sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So a bill that I worked on, actually it was last session, not this session, but one I'm really particularly proud of. So I do want to share it with you because it's a first in the nation bill on the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. So we learned through the hearing process. So I filed this bill because this woman, she worked in a commercial laundry, and she would be pushing those giant baskets of laundry, those big, giant, huge canvas rolling things of laundry. And she was pregnant. And so she went to her superior and said, I'm pregnant. I'm having some difficulty with the strenuous part of this job of pushing, these giant laundry carts. And I'm wondering if I could have an accommodation. I wonder if you could reassign me during this pregnancy because I'm finding this to be too difficult. And not only did her superior not reassign her, she gave her more responsibility and more strenuous work to do. And she ended up losing that pregnancy in like her 6th month before the fetus was viable. And she actually, I learned, has not been able to get pregnant since. And it was devastating, it was tragic. And so we filed this bill to be able to accommodate all pregnant workers. So if this bill had passed, it was in place, the law in place, she would have been granted that accommodation. She would have been able to work out that accommodation between she and her employer. And so, for instance, if someone is works at Market Basket and is at the cashier for 8 or 10 hours, there's a stool to sit on. You get more frequent breaks. Again, it's something that the employer and the employee can work out the accommodation together, what that looks like. But if you're working also, say you're an electric line worker and you're climbing telephone poles, you can't exactly be climbing a pole when you're very pregnant. So an accommodation, something reasonable, so that once that the baby is born and the postpartum has passed, that pregnant worker can then return to their job. Because what happens, what we were seeing is pregnant workers were being fired for being pregnant. So at a time when we need women to be in the workforce, to be able to support families, especially non-traditional families where a woman decides to have a child and not have the support of a significant other or otherwise, we want that person to be able to stay employed. We want to support that person. We don't want that person to risk a pregnancy or her own life to be able to have a child. So first in the nation bill, we got it passed. Many states have reached out to us to also file this legislation to support their pregnant workers, and as well as the federal government to do a federal bill. So really proud of that bill, and really proud that we were able to get that in place. And it's working here in Massachusetts. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. You should be very proud of that bill. Next, Representative Nguyen.
It's so great to hear about the different work that everyone's working on. For me, I think I am the one with the most recent election. I'm sure you all know, I got elected back in 2018 and now just finishing up my first term. And as I think the Senator Lovely said earlier, many of us in the first term are still working through the bill. So I have yet to pass any bill, but the exciting thing is I've gotten several bills out of committee, which I'm really proud of. But I think in addition to the legislative work, the most rewarding thing about the position that I'm in, and also just the campaign that we ran, was that the State House should be the people's house, and we need to work together to make sure that it's open and accessible to all. And one of the most exciting things about my race was that we got so many people who've never voted before to come out to vote. We've gotten so many people who have never stepped foot into the State House to come into the State House for the very first time. And I think that this is the power of making sure that we're bringing different voices to the table and making sure that we're running sorts of the sort of campaign as well as an office that really is open to all. And so for myself, I'm the very first Vietnamese American woman to ever be elected into the legislature. And actually, I think in any elected office in our state. And in that role, I've been able to reach out to a lot of different communities. And also, as someone who's worked very closely with nonprofits as well as advocacy groups, we've been able to bring in clients as well as young folks like yourself into the State House to introduce you to how the legislative process works, and trying to do what we can to inform people and let them know how government affects them and how we can work with just everyday folks to come up with good ideas that can impact everyday people. And that has been really the most rewarding experience, is to see people just have that light bulb go up of, oh, this is how it works, and this is why it's so important for me to be in touch with elected officials, to, you know, have a voice at the table and have someone help amplify that voice.
Thank you, Representative. And finally, Senator Jehlen. Oh, I'm sorry, I think you're on mute.
There we are. I'm sorry, we'll learn this stuff someday. So a lot of the bills we work on and a lot of the work we do, we never know the result of it, because, for example, when we passed a bill to keep people from using their cell phone while they're driving, we will never know the people whose lives were saved. So when we do preventive actions like that, for one of the bills I worked on was a child labor bill to try to keep people from putting a young person in charge of a convenience store at night, because we knew about the story of a young man who had been shot. He was 16 years old and he was running a convenience store at midnight, and that was not by himself. So that bill, the child labor bill, we will never know which kids were kept out of dangerous situations. But the one bill that I've worked on didn't affect very many people, but I've met some of the men who were kept in prison for many years, and then they were found to be innocent. They knew they were innocent all along, but when the court found them to be innocent, they were released. And after maybe 30 years in prison, with no resume, no experience, maybe no family, they came out with no money and no job and no place to live. And so we were able to pass a bill to allow them to gain compensation. It's been really hard for them. And actually, being with Congressman Lynch reminds me that one of the first men exonerated and who received compensation was an iron worker who not only had been an iron worker, he was then received back by his brothers in the union and went back to work. So knowing those men and knowing that without the assistance they got, their lives would have been even worse than they were, that has been very rewarding for me. But the other thing I wanted to say was that a lot of people think that all we do is work on legislation and budgets. But one of the most rewarding things to me during this pandemic has been that people call us for help and we're able to connect them with help. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's unemployment, getting them through some bureaucracy. Maybe it's helping them find housing resources or food. Those things are it makes me feel really good. It makes me feel sad that they are in those situations. And then it makes me feel glad that we can connect them with resources.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to throw it over to Tal, our developments director, who will ask some COVID-19 specific questions.
Thanks, Emily. So our first COVID-19 specific question is, how can constituents seek assistance from their elected officials during this pandemic, for example, with unemployment, healthcare, or immigration? And we can start off with anyone who wants to jump in.
It's Senator Lovely. I'll start. So I've got a fly that's buzzing around a little bit. So, you know what, people just need to know that they can call their elected, officials, that we're very accessible, as evidenced right here in this town hall that we're holding right here. But I think a lot of people don't think to call their elected official. So I would just stress that we're accessible. We're all human beings. And I mean, I used to think when I was a young person, I never would have thought to call, my state senator or my state representative. I just thought they were just too far away and too removed for someone like me to access. That's not true at all. We are very accessible. So we would want people to certainly call our offices, even though we're not working in the State House, or we're all working remotely to be safe. Our phones are ringing, so I have a staff of 5 that works for me. And we are connected through Teams, which is a platform through Microsoft Office. And it is terrific. We are speaking to each other multiple times a day. And we're also accessing ourselves through a platform like this. And also, we're meeting with constituents, we're still conducting our day-to-day business. People are still advocating for bills. We have advocacy groups and different constituencies that want to see these important bills passed this session. So I think we were busy before the pandemic. I would say we're as busy, if not busier now, because we are helping people, for example, with unemployment. The unemployment system, as Senator Jehlen said, is pretty overwhelmed right now. It went from a call center of 70 people helping to over 700, and they've gone to work 7 days a week. And it's still taking some of our constituents up to a week to get a response. And when you don't have any funds coming in, you don't have any income coming in, that's extremely stressful. When you need to get to the grocery store, or you need to pay your rent or an electric bill, or put gas in your car, it's really stressful. So we want people to call us because we can greatly assist, and we are making a big difference, for example, with unemployment. And so I would say that to all of you, and let all of your friends know and your families know, we're here to help. That's what government's supposed to do. Government is here to help. And so I would, stress that please give us a call. You can find us through Facebook, through any of the social media, telephone, or email, and we're here to assist. So thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with everything that the senator said. And in addition to that, we in my office, we've also have started town halls to touch upon different topics that constituents may be interested in, and also inviting them to ask questions during these town halls. And we solicit different topics based on the interest of our constituents. So we have one coming up on this Thursday on, mail-in voting and what voting would look like under COVID-19, because those are the questions that keep coming into us. We have another one on unemployment, because we have so many people reaching out with different rules and regulations and different acts coming into play. A lot of folks are really just at a loss and have a lot of concerns and questions. And also, we're hearing of new things that could be coming out, like the HEROES Act at the federal level, and folks want to know, like, how would that impact them? And we try to work with other experts, because by all means, none of us are experts in all. Were you able to hear me or any of that?
I can't. just at the end.
10 seconds.
Oh, it just muted on its own yet. But so we try to work together and bring in experts to answer a lot of the questions. As one of the other panelists mentioned, we have about 5,000, but actually I think it's probably up to closer to 6,500 bills filed. And I have to say, I'm not an expert in many of these areas. And so we pull on each other's strengths and I did a lot of employment law in the past, so I understand the unemployment system somewhat, but even so I'd like to bring in others to try to highlight some of the issues that have been going on. But a lot of what we've been doing too is trying to go onto social media to try to answer a lot of the questions. And so my Facebook page, I'm always trying to put out new information that's coming my way to make sure that it gets to the people. And we also have a weekly newsletter that goes out that does a summary of all the changes that have happened, within the week, that week, because things are changing minute by minute. And folks have been really responsive to the newsletters. And in fact, I just sent one out today and just saw that a bunch of questions came in, because the more information we put out there, I guess, the more questions people have. But these are all ways for us to try to be there for the people, because I know during this time of uncertainty, information is key and people want to know what is happening, or at least get some information from us and know that we're there. And so I'm really glad to be able to be in that role for my constituents.
Thank you so much. Such great answers. So now we're going to move on to our last COVID-19 related question. And it is, what will voting look like in the fall? Are any measures being taken to protect the voting process? And anyone, again, can jump in.
Why don't I take a shot at this? Steve Lynch. So as you may know, we've been trying to get a vote by mail bill done in the Congress. We did put $400 million in the CARES Act that passed previously. In that same bill, we put in 25 on the House side. We put in $25 billion for the United States Postal Service, and that was not only because, look, the Postal Service continues to deliver mail, packages, medicines, critical items to every home and business in America 6 days a week. But we are going to have to, because of the coronavirus, we're going to have to rely on them heavily to conduct the next election. And so we put that $25 billion in for the Postal Service. It went over to the Senate, and in conference, as my colleagues will know, can sometimes be a painful process. Mitch McConnell reduced it to $6 billion from $25 billion, and then when it went to the White House for negotiations, it was a three-way negotiation. They eliminated all that extra resources for the Postal Service. So now we have a new bill. We just passed last week the HEROES Act, and we've reinserted the $25 billion for the Postal Service. And also we've put $1 trillion aside for the states for them to. There's a lot of discretionary money there. There's also quite a bit of money there for CDBG, which generally is allocated to the mayors, but also sometimes allocated by formula. But we've got a real challenge. We've got a real challenge on our hands. The president has come out with a position that he believes that voting by mail enhances fraud. But like so many of his allegations, there's no factual basis for those allegations. We saw what happened in Wisconsin, where people came out in very difficult circumstances. There were a number of coronavirus cases related to everybody coming out, and it's there are still people who are fearful, and we're worried that the voter turnout will be less than would otherwise be the case if we had people who weren't afraid to go out and cast their ballots and weren't afraid were unable to cast their ballot by mail. So we've got very strong support for that on the Democratic side. It's been mixed on the Republican side, but we're hoping in this next round of negotiations over the HEROES Act, we'll be able to get enough resources there to conduct a full and fair election. But the battle goes on. This is a real point of contention between ourselves and the White House.
Thank you so much. Emma, our co-operations director, will now begin the student question section.
Thanks, Tal. Now we're going to ask questions that students have already pre-submitted. And we had a lot of questions submitted, so unfortunately we might not get to all of them. Our Wellesley High School State of the Students members will read out the questions, and all panelists that are welcome to answer questions that aren't directed to a specific panelist. Here's our first question.
So our first question is from Rachel from Westboro High, and she asks, what ways are you working to balance public opinion with medical professionals' advice when passing and drafting coronavirus legislation?
I don't want to dominate. Well, as you may know, we've had many medical experts come in and testify before Congress on this to work with us. We've had a number of previous CDC, Center for Disease Control, and HHS secretaries that have come in and advised us on how to approach this. Our program for testing really came from a number of former CDC directors and HHS directors, CDC principally because they had dealt with the situation with Ebola, and many of them were Massachusetts natives or had connections with institutions here in Massachusetts, and they were incredibly helpful in helping us to use the best medical evidence, the best science to underpin our legislation when trying to address the coronavirus. So I'll yield back. Thank you.
This is Senator Lovely. I'll just add that that's what's happening at the state level as well. And I would say that Massachusetts is following data-driven decisions, not date-driven decisions. The data will tell us how quickly we can open up, how quickly we can get back to work. This is a very aggressive virus. So as we're drafting legislation, we have to remember that we have to be consulted by the data and not work with dates. And it's hard because you can see other states in our country that have opened up. I think over the weekend we saw news clips of hundreds of people in swimming pools and people at a racetrack, and no one was wearing masks. And so when we're looking at legislation or supporting the administration, the governor, we need to be looking at the data. Those states where that's happening, they're seeing a surge in infections and hospitalizations and deaths. And we've been hit extremely hard here in Massachusetts. We're third in the country. New York was hit the worst, and New Jersey, then our state. And so we need to be mindful when we are drafting legislation related to coronavirus that we are looking at the data. If we open up too soon, we could put ourselves into another surge and a complete lockdown of the state again. And that would, things are pretty bad, but it could certainly, that would make it a lot worse. So data, not dates. Thank you.
And to briefly add to that, I think that it's good to emphasize that even though we're working under very different circumstances, and of course, voting remotely and meeting in caucus remotely, as well as committees doing committee work remotely, legislation is still going through the legislative process, which means that you draft legislation, the committee works on it, and we still solicit public feedback in terms. And I absolutely agree that our decisions are based on data, but we do want feedback from the public. We want to hear from the public. For instance, we recently worked on, I'm on the municipalities committee, and we worked on a bill to try to address issues that arise for local elections, because as I'm sure many of you know, those are in the spring, right when the virus hit around March, April, and they had to postpone the town elections as well as town meetings. And we were reaching out to folks to let us know what are the problems and how can we craft legislation to reflect the actuality of the realities of what's going on the ground. And so that's that's the balance, is to draft something as quickly as possible to address whatever issue it is that we see, but also taking the time to vet it, go through the entire process, and make sure that we're listening to different voices as the bill goes through the legislative process.
And I want to say that I think it's not just public opinion versus medical professionals. Medical professionals can give you their best guess about what different policies will lead to, but there is still judgment calls about you cannot keep everybody safe all the time. For example, if you want people to eat, the grocery store workers have to go to work and the supply chain people have to go to work. And so you're making judgments all the time about which risks, which people are going to be asked to take. So it's not just public opinion versus opinion, of professionals, but also what the costs are of different solutions. The other thing I say is that Massachusetts, especially, I think public opinion is reflecting the caution of our leaders. And we are not in a situation like some states where people are in large numbers rallying against keeping the economy relatively closed. So I think we're lucky in this state to have fairly balanced leadership and a public that is supporting trying to be careful about reopening. But it will matter not just what policies are, but what people do. And if people obey the advice of trying to keep themselves and other people safe. So each one of us has a job to do in trying to recover from the coronavirus.
So Rachel from Andover High School asks, ever since the early cases of COVID-19 in the US, several elected officials at the highest levels of government have used racist scapegoating language to fuel fear, bias, and blame. These actions have resulted in discrimination and several racist attacks targeted at Asian Americans. As a lawmaker, Representative Nguyen, how are you working to combat misinformation and protect these vulnerable communities who have endured these abuses?
Rachel, thank you so much for the information, and congratulations on, I'm assuming you're a senior, but I know that Andover High Schools has their graduation coming up. I thank you for the question. I am very troubled by the anti-Asian sentiment that's been going on since the outbreak of COVID-19. If you've been following the papers, as part of the Asian Caucus, we've been very vocal and working very closely with the Asian American Commission of Massachusetts to basically combat the misinformation, put out positive information, and especially given that May is AAPI Heritage Month, we are doing everything that we can to push out information about the contributions that Asian Americans have made, especially focusing on the work that healthcare workers, AAPI healthcare workers who have contributed to combating the pandemic head on. Additionally, we've been working with other elected officials, including folks from, Michelle Wu, our city councilor in Boston, as well as other AAPI electeds throughout the state, to make sure that we are on the same page and sending out a consistent message that we are here to support the Asian American community, to make sure that we are addressing any issues that may come up and working closely with law enforcement to enforce to address the hate crimes that are resulting from since the pandemic broke out. And we'd love to hear from you. We're actually soliciting information from folks because we want to hear where there are issues to address, and work with the communities to make sure that we give the right resources to combat the misinformation that's been brewing out there.
Thank you, Representative. Our next question is from Ruby from Newton North. How has working and meeting digitally changed the way Congress functions? Do you think there are any changes in process or in culture that will sustain beyond this pandemic? And if so, do you think they will be for the worst or for the better?
Sorry about that. Well, as Senator Lovely pointed out, you think we wouldn't be as busy as we once were, but nevertheless, I am. I mean, so we have probably 3 or 4 caucus calls each day that can go, depending on the topic and who the briefers are, can go for a couple of hours. So there's not enough time in the day. Other issues that we're dealing with are, I've had a number of constituents who have been sort of trapped overseas. We had a big group in Honduras. We had a big group in Morocco. We had a big group in Turkey, big group in Egypt that were, some of them were on family vacation. Some were students on international programs. So I think in terms of our communications online, I think it's forced a lot of members to get savvy in terms of how to communicate with each other and with their constituents. So I think it's been good in that respect. We just passed a proxy voting bill in the House. So it doesn't have to go to the Senate, it doesn't have to go to the President. So we've changed our rules. So tomorrow I fly out early flight, and so that'll be available to any member who can't get to Washington. They can go through a proxy voting process where they have a member who is present vote on their behalf. So that's sort of a big change in Congress. I don't feel comfortable. I'm pretty close. I have an hour flight, so it's not too bad. But some people, coming in from Alaska or Hawaii or even like Montana, North and South Dakota, sometimes those people have an 8 or 9 hour commute between driving to the airport, the small airport, big airport, then flying in and then driving to DC. It's an ordeal, and people are very nervous about getting on flights because even though the last few flights have been very sparsely, there have been very few passengers on board. One of my flights had like 6 people on board. One had maybe 8. The last one had about 14. That's the most I've seen. So maybe things are starting to open up a little bit. But, we've been told that sometimes in your commute, that time you spend on the plane is the time most likely where you might become infected because the air is circulated, and if someone's sitting next to you, it's very difficult to maintain that social distancing. So yes, it's been a change. We're trying to adjust. We still believe that getting together in Congress and having that live debate and the exchange of ideas, having members get together, and the optics of it. You want your leaders to be present. You want your elected leaders to be, it's like being the captain of the ship. They should be the last ones to leave, right? You want them to be responsible. You want them to be accountable and accessible. So it's really created a tension, not being able to meet in large committees. When we vote now, we sit up in the gallery. So because obviously with 435 members of the House, you got to do your best to try to spread out. So we sit in the balcony, which now the public is not allowed into the Capitol. So the balcony, the gallery is open to members to sit and observe debate. So that's been one of the steps we've taken to try to maintain that active debate in the House, but yet recognize the circumstances and try to keep everyone safe. Thanks.
Thank you. We now have one final question for all our panelists. What is something you want your young constituents to know about the role of government in their lives? We can start off with Rep. Nguyen.
Thank you for that. It is so important for students to know that there's absolutely a role for them to play, because so much of what we do impacts you on a daily basis. For instance, we just passed the Student Opportunity Act, which affects funding to schools. We're now dealing with COVID-19 and trying to work out to see when schools will start. And again, it goes back to data. We want to hear about the issues that students are facing, whether they can't access broadband or they used to rely on, to go to the library to access a computer, what that's like, or what other issues are going on in their lives and how government could help address them. And when it comes to education, I mean, it's not just the education part, it's also about what resources are available to them. Do you have food on the table? How is your mental health? That's just as important as physical health. All of these things are things that us in government are concerned about. We want to hear from students and their families to see what is needed and what additional, whether it's legislation or initiatives, could we work on to make sure that the needs are met. And we encourage students to be involved, whether it is reaching out to the legislature to give an opinion or apply to our offices to work as interns. I think the interest in government really stems from knowing how it works and being in building. Unfortunately, we won't have a in-building internship experience for the summer due to COVID-19, but we've had many interns go through our office and to try to understand and see all that's happening. And we hope that such exposure will encourage more students to be civically engaged and know that at the end of the day, we are very accessible and we're just regular people trying to do the right things and making sure that we're, weighing the pros and cons, and we're always soliciting ideas from folks. In fact, I work with students very closely on different initiatives. Like we've had rallies, to rally for gun safety. We've had a panel on environmental issues and protection that we need to address. And these are all initiatives that were that students reached out to me, and I was glad to be able to work on those things. And also, I've gone to classrooms. I've gone to many government classes to try to speak to the students and answer questions that they may have. And these interactions, I hope, would encourage them to be more active and encourage their friends to be more active in government or with elected officials.
Thank you so much. Congressman Lynch?
Sure. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me. This has been wonderful. And it's great to get together with my colleagues at the state level. As you may guess, we work really close together. We have a wonderful congressional delegation, and most of us have served, I would say almost all of us have served at the state level. So we were state reps and state senators. So I rely on that experience when I was at the State House, and I still rely on those relationships and the goodwill and the spirit of collegiality that still exists between the state and the federal delegations in our state. And it's a real honor for me to be here. What I would want the young people in Massachusetts to understand is that your town, your city, your state, and your nation need you. So there are rich opportunities to become engaged, right? There are wonderful opportunities. Most of them, people, I spent a lot of time, as Representative Nguyen talked about, going to schools, mostly colleges, but some high schools, and just talking about the opportunities that are there for internships, either with a legislator, a member of Congress, or with an agency. So, if you have an interest in the environment, there are internships at the EPA and MEPA. There are opportunities with the State Department that are you know, they're competitive, but they're incredibly rewarding. I had an opportunity last summer to meet with some young people who were doing they had got assignment through the Peace Corps in Tanzania, Africa, and they were working on HIV prevention with the Maasai tribes people. So some just wonderful, rich, and rewarding and meaningful and life-changing experiences, and they're available. So obviously, if I can be helpful in guiding you, I'm happy to do that. But you know, there is a responsibility for all of us, right? You want to live your life in a meaningful cause. You really want to do that. Everybody wants to do that. And there are opportunities to do that. And I would just say, seek them out. If you're not in my district, obviously you have a member of Congress. I know Representative Kennedy represents a lot of you. United States Representative Joe Kennedy represents a lot of the people on this call. But wherever you live, you should be able to access those opportunities, and I encourage you to do so. And thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. Senator Jehlen?
So the question was, what do you want students to know about the role of government in their lives? And I just keep thinking about the idea that we're all in this together. The way that we show, the way that we be together, and the way that we help each other every day is through government. We help use government to make it possible for other people and ourselves to exist. As we think about reopening the economy, we think about what it takes for people to go to work. And it takes transit, it takes roads, it takes daycare for their children, it takes schools so they don't have to worry about where their kids are, and so that kids will grow up and be able to participate in the economy. It takes public health so that people are healthy and have a chance to get well. There's so many things that we take for granted, and now we're talking about what's essential. And the essential workers are ones often who are not very well paid and have been taken for granted. And that we need to think about how we make it possible for people to do that essential work and still pay their rent and pay for their groceries. So the virus has exposed some real deep problems in our communities, and I hope we will use this experience to think about caring for each other and making sure that the people who do essential work can survive. And thank you for having me. And I also am glad to have interns, and I'm glad to hear from my constituents anytime. I know there's at least one on here. And I'm glad to talk to you. Oh dear, there's my phone. Okay, sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much for that. It's very important. And finally, Senator Lovely. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Sorry. If you saw a man come into my screen a little while ago, my husband delivered me dinner. So I've got a really yummy cheeseburger sitting right here waiting for me. But I too want to say thank you for the opportunity to just sit together and share ideas, listen to your questions, offer some remarks. I've learned a lot from my fellow legislators, federal and state. You know, we learn from each other, and we learn from you. You know, so as you know, student constituents, it's really valuable to be able to listen to you and what your thoughts are and what your concerns are and what your priorities are. You know, we represent everybody in this Commonwealth, and so it's you know, and the votes that we take today have a very effect on you as our future generations who will take over at some point. And so we want to make sure we get it right as we can get it. And you bring a tremendous amount of value to the conversation. So I want to say thank you for doing that. And please know that we are here. We are approachable. We are available, because that's what government, as Senator Jehlen was saying, that's what we do. That's what government is supposed to provide. We provide for, all the different, things that we need to make our lives work. And, we're very, very concerned, again, for vulnerable populations. If you look at the city of Chelsea, 30% of the city of Chelsea has been infected. A third, or almost a third, and that number may grow, because Chelsea is a very dense, it's 1 square mile, it's a very dense community where people live very closely together, and where a lot of our, our essential workers live, who may be working in supermarkets and in different types of lower paid jobs. And through no fault of their own, that has had the virus has had a tremendous impact there. And this is what we need to learn from, and how we need to protect the residents of Chelsea and all across our Commonwealth. So, this has been really just great for me to be here, to be a part of this process. I was kind of scrolling through, and there's a lot of folks, even though I can't see a lot of pictures, there's a lot of students on this platform today, and I'm just very grateful, again, to be part of it. And just be safe, be careful. Representative Nguyen said, take care of your mental health. We're all in this together. It's uncharted territory. We've never done this before, whether you're my generation, my cohort, or your cohort. We're doing it together, and together we can make a positive impact. So stay in touch with us. And we're here to help. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming to get to know your government. If you take one thing away from this past hour, let it be this: it is your government, it works for you. Have a nice day.